And tonight is especially exciting for us because Morgan Entrekin, who's CEO and publisher of Grove Atlantic and founder of LitHub, is also a winner of the Center for Fiction's Perkins Award, which honors the work of an editor, publisher, or agent who, over the course of his career, has discovered, nurtured, and championed writers of fiction in the United States. And fittingly, he will be in conversation with one of his discoveries, Karl Marlantes, whose novel Matterhorn won the Center for Fiction's first novel prize. So we're especially excited for this conversation tonight and to hear the story of how they began to work together and also to celebrate Karl's new novel, Deep River. So let's welcome them both to the stage.
Thank you. I'm Morgan, that's Karl. And it's great to be out of this beautiful building, which I haven't been to. The place on Midtown on 47th Street was nice too, but this is really spectacular. So thank you guys for coming out. And I think what we're going to do is talk for 25 or 30 minutes and just tell you about our relationship as editor and publisher and author, and then open it up to questions if anybody's interested in talking about some of what you hear. I heard about Karl in 2009, I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
So at that point, I had been in publishing since 1977. I was in my mid-50s, and I grew up as an editor in the business. I was an editor first at Delacorte and then at Simon & Schuster. But I went out on my own at the age of 29 and it sort of put together these two companies, Grove and Atlantic. So by 1993, and that, it took me a lot away from editing and more into being the publishing side, and so the business side of the business. And I kept my hand in with a little bit of editing with a handful of writers that I'd worked with for a while. But by the time I was in my mid-50s, I thought, I'm not going to really be discovering any more debut authors, because usually when you discover the debut authors, it's when you're younger, like you're in your 20s or your 30s, and people like Will Self or Francisco Goldman or Dagoberto Gilb or a number of others over the years. But so I got a phone call on a Friday afternoon from Cecily Hensley, who was the head fiction buyer at Barnes & Noble and an old friend. And she said, Morgan, I'm reading a book that I think would interest you. And she described Matterhorn, and she told me a little bit of the story. She didn't know the whole story, but she said, there's this guy who's been working on this book for 30 years. He couldn't find an agent, and he couldn't find a publisher. And a small, not-for-profit house in Berkeley
Leon Literary Arts
has taken the book on. And it has been submitted for the Discover New Writers program at Barnes & Noble. And this is a tribute to the quality of the booksellers at Barnes & Noble, because you and your wife, Anne, you were trying to figure out, well, we've got this publisher finally.
No, I can tell you the story. It was this chain of women. I tried for 30 years. People say, well, it took you that long to write it. It took me that long to get it published. But the funny part of the story is, I could get nowhere. I have hundreds of query letters, that I would send out and come back and no, it doesn't fit our list, and that's one of the great ones, doesn't fit our list. And so one day, a friend of mine was reading the manuscript, and an old friend of his who had started Leon Literary Arts, he's a professor at Berkeley, called him on the phone, and they were talking about his new nonprofit. It was just two people, Tom and a part-time editor she's retired, and she used to work for Lonely Planet. And my friend said to him, he said, well, I've got this manuscript, and it's pretty good. And he said, well, you want to read it? And Tom was like, oh, well, send it to he called her my senior editor, Kit Duane. Tom's a little full of BS, But anyway, my friend calls me on the phone, and I could always remember this because he said, wow, he says, my friend's got this publishing company, sent it down. I said, Ken, it's a novel about Marines in the Vietnam War, and you want me to send it to a female reader in Berkeley, California? I said, this is just never going to go anywhere. And and then what happened is that they took it. Kit loved it, and she was the one that read it, and so they decided to publish it. I had I sold everything, all the rights, for 120 free copies. That was the deal, and they had all the rights, and they made a run of 1,200, and I got 120. And then it was like back in the garage, 120 books. Now what do we do? And the same problem. I couldn't find a publisher. I couldn't find, an agent. And so I'm still having the same problem. So then Anne came up with the idea of entering it in the contest. And that's how it got to Barnes & Noble.
So the Barnes & Noble Discover New Writers program, booksellers all over the country read submitted titles. And it kind of made its way slowly through that system and up the food chain to Cecily Hensley at the top. And she was about a third of the way through the book, and she called me and she said, I'm reading this book. She told me what she knew of the story, and she said, I think you might like it. And our offices were about 5 blocks away, and I said, well, actually I'll come over and pick it up right now. And I read it over the weekend. It was 900 pages. It was a trade paperback, I think, priced at $25.
Right.
And what Cecily had said was, the book needs to be cut, and it needs to be published in hardcover or a cheaper trade paperback. And so, to make a very long story short, I read it, I liked it. I happened to be going to Berkeley a couple of weeks later. I met Tom. I bought all 1,200 copies of the L. Leon Literary Arts
because the deal was all the rights would revert to me once the run was sold out or 3 years went by. So Morgan bought all the books.
Right.
Whatever happened to them? Where are they?
They're very valuable, actually. We some of them they sell online for a premium. We gave them. Remember, we did something with Powell's that we did some special thing. I can't remember.
Anyway,
but
okay. Yeah.
but so we then had a $25 900-page novel that I thought needed to be cut a little bit, and so in this process, Karl got an agent. And
Morgan gave me the 3 names.
And he got a great agent from ICM Sloan Harris. And then I said to him, well, I don't know if any of you have read Matterhorn, but I said, I think we need maybe a little bit more of the backstory of some of these officers at front, but then I think we need a little bit less of the Trail of Tears, and then maybe whatever. And at the time, it was very challenging for me to line edit a 900-page book, because it's very time-consuming to do line editing, for those of you in the audience who've ever tried it. And I worked with a really smart young colleague, Jofi Ferrari Adler, who's now just launched his own imprint. He did 3 Women. That was his first book, avid reader. So Jofi did the work in the trenches, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we cut that book to probably around 600 pages.
Yeah.
And published it in hardcover in the spring of 2010, and it went on to great success. And interestingly, one of the reasons, I was born in 1955, so I'm a few years younger than Karl, but the Vietnam War sort of hung over my youth in that I was the last year where you had to register for the draft. And it was a time, for those of you who were old enough in the room who remember, it was a very divisive time and a very intense time dealing with it. And as I went through my career, I had published a lot of military history. I published Black Hawk Down, probably one of the better known books, and I have an interest in military history. And what I thought was, I also had worked with Tim O'Brien. I joined Delacorte the year that we published Going After Cacciato. And Mike Hare was a friend. I published a book of Mike Hare's who wrote Dispatches. And so much of the literature around Vietnam had been the same kind of this anti-realist reflection of those times, of the sort of, chaoticness and the sort of traditional narratives. And what I was actually looking for, I had tried to convince Mark Bowden to go back and do a book on the Tet Offensive and the Battle of Hue City, which was, in my opinion, the turning point of that war. And he didn't want to do it. He actually later did it, and we published it 2 years ago, but it's another story. But so I thought that it was time to go revisit Vietnam. And I was looking for the nonfiction book about a single action, and divorced from all the politics around it. Because, what I realized as I gotten older and met many of the veterans was that most of them didn't want to be there. And it was, they went and they served in whatever way they served, but I thought, those stories have never been told. So it was a very receptive kind of, when I read Matterhorn, I was very receptive to it. And if you haven't read it, it's a terrific war novel, and it's absolutely gripping. But it's a novel that's closer to The Naked and the Dead than it is to Going After Cacciato. But so when one of the reasons that I think that you tend to publish your contemporaries, and I think you also tend to publish writers that are your same gender, not always. I have published some women writers, is that that kind of reflects your tastes and your interests. And what I've always thought about in my relationships with authors is that the most productive ones have been with people that I've been able to become close to and friends with. And in the old days, I would hang out a lot with them and go out to dinner and go to bars, or a couple of times I would go out on the road and go on the author tours with them. And as we got to know each other better, I did a wonderful book with a South African writer named Rian Milan called My Trader's Heart. And I didn't know much about South Africa, and we published that book in 1990, but Rian is exactly my age. He comes from the Milan family that the airport's named after. They were some of the earliest settlers and basically had a role in every event in South African history, and his great uncle, D.F. Milan, was one of the architects of apartheid. I grew up in the South, and so there's a similarity in terms of that history of white responsibility and guilt, and it was ways we got to know each other that we really could communicate. Now, with Karl, there was enough of a generational gap. Also, I had gotten married late in life and became a dad late in life, and I wasn't hanging out in bars and I wasn't going on the road very much, but we did.
And I live in the Northwest and don't hang out in New York.
But we did get to know each other some, and that was where the second book came from, because Karl told me the experience of struggling for 30 years, basically writing in part to come to terms with your experience. I mean, you want to talk a little bit?
Well, a friend of mine actually nailed it, because I mean, literally both of these books, I would end up just sobbing when I was writing. I mean, snot on the keyboard sobbing, not sort of weepy, just and because it was enormously emotional, and I was dealing with post-traumatic stress, which when I started writing Matterhorn, we'd never heard of, and had to go through all that, and one first marriage, fell apart in large part because of that, and he said, "What you're doing," he said, "is you're turning your ghosts into ancestors," and that really reverberated with me. His name's Joe Bobro. He's a Zen monk, I think, but anyway, because we all have these experiences in our lives, that are part of our lives, that are very traumatic. And if they're ghosts, they haunt you. That's why you get into bar fights, or you lose your marriage, or you do stupid stuff, because it's unconscious. And writing, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to turn those ghosts into ancestors. You'll never get rid of them. I mean, I will never get rid of or forget my combat experience. But getting it out in front of me, I see it there, instead of having it haunt me from the inside and ruining my life. It's still part of it. And there's other methods. I mean, paintings, music, talking with people. There's a lot of ways of getting a ghost to an ancestor. But the process in both of these books was that. The intentions were very different. I wanted very much in the fiction to tell a good story and tell sort of our story. What is it like to be 19 and trying to grow up in the middle of a war, and how do you deal with that? The second book, What It's Like to Go to War, is nonfiction, and I wanted to, I guess in a way, sort of like find meaning. I don't believe that. I believe you make your meaning. I don't think you just find it out there hidden under a rock someplace. So you make it, and so I made my meaning for the war by writing about it, so that if young people wanted to have a military career, they would go into it without any romanticism. I wanted very much to sort of tell them, this is what it's like to go to war, which is Morgan's time.
Well, but interestingly, where this came from was as we got to know each other, and in fact, we traveled around the country a little bit prior to publication, so that I could introduce you to our friends up in Seattle who sell some books, and so we took you to the sales conference and took you around. And I was talking to Karl, and he was talking about how he couldn't get his novel published, but he would write nonfiction versions of it in journals, and that you were doing some of the work of the Robert Bly, and you were reading Joseph Campbell's. This was all through the 70s and 80s as people were dealing with some of these issues of masculinity, et cetera. And I was intrigued by it. And he was saying, and somebody had told him, oh, you should turn that into a nonfiction book. And it was like, and I kept...
Yeah, well, the deal was, well, if you can't get published in fiction, there's a better market for nonfiction because there's always somebody that'll buy that. And no one knows who your name is.
I don't know if I've told you this, of the time that I really was persuaded. I remember, I think Sloan had maybe read some of those pages, and I had said, is there a book there? Is there a book in these? Because I had loved Matterhorn so much, and I said, I'm so interested in listening to Karl talk about these issues because he's so thoughtful about it, and he's obviously been thinking about it and dealing with these things for decades, literally. Yeah. But we were having breakfast with Harvey, and Chuck Pfeiffer came to join. And this was a fellow that I knew who was, Harvey Keitel served as a Marine and is a friend of mine, and I'd given him an early copy of Matterhorn. He was a huge fan, and he asked if he could meet Karl when he was in town. And so we had breakfast, and there was another old friend of mine who highly decorated, a West Point graduate, Green Beret, highly decorated veteran of Vietnam, and he very much wanted to meet Karl. And so we went to breakfast down in Tribeca, and Harvey left, and I'm sitting with Chuck and Karl, and they start talking about the experience of combat. And as he writes about in this book, it's not something that many people who've experienced combat talk to other people about. And you said something that morning. You said, I have read history and philosophy and religion and psychology, trying to come to terms with this. And he's talking to someone else who's experienced this. And he said, the closest thing in human experience that I can feel is religious ecstasy. If you experience combat, you go to a different place in your head. And you come back, but you are never the same. And even just telling the story right now, I get chills, because I was at the table listening to these two men talk about this, and it was something that I don't think many non-combat veterans get to experience. And after that, I turned to you and I said, I know there's a book in those pages, and I have to read them all. And so I read 2,000 pages, a whole lot of Iron John, Robert Bly stuff that was like so dated, and so like, and that again, I didn't have the time to edit it myself. But we hired a fellow who, I've forgotten his name now, I'm sorry to say, but he had worked as an editor for one of the Random House imprints, and he was a veteran, but he was actually younger than me, I think, so I don't think he had seen combat, but he was versed, and he had done a lot of military history. And we talked to him about the shape of that book. So most of my editing with Karl in those first two books was more just conceptual. Of that we took 2,000 pages into this, and it was my title, because I thought that this is the focus of what this is. I want to take the essence of that conversation we had at breakfast of what it's like to go to war. And I don't know if you've read this book or not, but it's quite extraordinary. And as Karl says, we have throughout history, war is prehistoric. It's been with us for all time. And up until about 200 years ago, we carefully prepared the mainly young men to go off to have to do this terrible thing in order to protect the tribe or the nation or whatever we called it. But we also prepared them to come back. And we had methods. We had. I mean, you can articulate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Native American sweat lodges. They have the warrior sweat lodge when the warriors come back. It was specifically designed to do rebirth, to bring them back into the community. The issue that is so difficult is that when you leave, I mean, some of the Native Americans even used different language when they were fighting. They would use warrior language.
Well, and this is what you and Sebastian have been working on for the last years, because, and finally we're starting to make some headway, because I offered to give copies to all of the military academies for every graduate to read it, and we got a lot of pushback, because that means they're not doing their job, right? Well, I think also they probably thought it was a little bit new agey or whatever. But
I'll tell you, the Commandant of the Marine Corps has put it on his required reading list for all Marine sergeants and young officers. And it's taught at the Naval War College now, and it's taught at Annapolis. And West Point's trying to get me to come up there to talk to them right now. So they have I've been very proud of Marines in particular have just embraced it.
We've lost more young men and women to suicide than we have to combat over these last
24 a day is what the current rate is.
But so those are those two books. So then we have got the next book and the book we've come to talk about tonight. Now, so Karl tells me, Karl's Finnish and Greek and his ancestors. And so he says, I got an idea, I want to do a book about my grandmothers and some of the community that I grew up in. And can you tell where that sort of came from a little bit?
Well,
this is Deep River.
This is Deep River. My father's first language is Greek, and my mother's first language is Finnish. And I grew up in a household. Her father was a Norwegian, and her stepfather was a Swede, or Swedish-speaking Finn. So we had 5 languages in the house. If you could, and my brother called it cultural linguistic schizophrenia because I mean, you guys. I mean, the difference between the Greek culture and the Finnish culture is. I mean, I can tell you. I mean, okay, Sophia, my Greek grandmother, we would take her to the Greek church about twice a year over the mountains. It was several hours drive to go to Portland. And you walk into the Greek church and the priest's up there with the smoke and everything and chanting in Greek, and she's shouting at her friends all the way across, hey, Anastasia, how's your granddaughter? What is she doing? Oh, Sophia, we haven't seen you for so long. And, I mean, it's the middle of the church service, and they're shouting at each other, and this was going on. Go to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. I mean, it's like, you know, I could tell Finnish jokes because I'm half Finnish. But I mean, this will give you an idea of the Finnish culture. And so, you know, Toivo and Lena were married for 55 years, and sadly, Lena died. And at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, Toivo was in the front pew at the funeral, and a couple of his friends were sitting behind him, and one of the friends leaned over the other and he says, you know, Toivo really loved Lena. He told her once. That's the Finns, and you'll see in this novel, there's whole conversations where the men just say, yo, you know, they have one word. And so I kind of wanted to capture some of that culture. It's a remarkable culture.
Well,
you know.
But what's interesting to me is that I'm not always involved in this book. I was basically helped create conceptually the idea of, because I heard about it and then saw the journals, and we, you know, this one, I was presented a 45-page outline that
58.
58. I'm sorry.
Don't sell me short.
I don't know if any of you have read the book. It's absolutely fantastic, but it was this idea of a family of Finnish immigrants to the Pacific Northwest and the Scandinavians settling there in the logging industry and fishing. And it's like completely rich, dense environment. But it had, it started with 5, or maybe were there 6?
Five siblings.
5 siblings with these Finnish names. And I said, wait, man, I said, that's not going to work. That's too many people. You're not going to be able to follow all those characters.
Yeah.
And so...
No, I cut some brothers out.
Yeah. Well, but you didn't listen to start, so you delivered...
I cut one out to start, then I got the manuscript done. It was like still too many brothers. No, I love to tell this story on Morgan. I love to tell this story on it. So, I mean, I worked my ass off to get this manuscript done on time. I missed the deadline, but I finally got to do it, and it was 350,000 words. Okay, this is 220, all right? So that's a big manuscript, and I sent it in, and there was total silence from New York.
I'm like a little busy, 350,000
that's
words.
Right.
So I
total
can't just
silence.
read it over the weekend.
A week went by, a month went by, 2 months, finally 10 weeks. I got a 6-word email from Morgan. Great stuff, too much of it. I mean, you writers out there, you can deal with New York editors. You got to have a thick skin, you know. So I told him. I said, Morgan, I said, Anna Karenina is 351,000 words, and I quote, I couldn't sell Anna Karenina today. But the one thing
I've always War and Peace first, maybe I
know. I was going to say the one thing he didn't say to me because he was kind. He said, "You ain't Tolstoy," you know. Yeah. So, yeah.
But the other thing, of course, is I am running a fairly complicated business. I'd also launched Literary Hub by then, or about to launch it, and so it was hard for me to go in and do the line editing, but. I would read the draft, and then we had a terrific young editor, Allison Malika, who worked with me and worked diligently.
She was great.
Through 2 drafts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And We persuaded Karl to lose one of the brothers. So we got.
And when you lose a brother, you lose the siblings. You lose the wife or the husband, and you also lose the kids.
Sad.
So cutting one brother out
goes to the cutting room
solved a
floor.
lot of problems.
I could have saved you a year or two if you'd have just listened in the beginning. But
I always learn the hard way.
But so we went to draft after draft, and there is extraordinary logging stuff in this. In fact, this is a good moment. Why don't you? I'm not watching the clock very well. But
It's we're half hours over, so.
okay, so why don't you read this, and then we'll wrap up the conversation, and people can move to it.
That's good.
What I loved so much was the texture of the settling of this area of America and the harvesting of these first growth forests, which, and in a very short amount of time. And well, you can tell.
Well, I mean, when I was a kid in grade school, you would feel the log trucks go through town. I grew up in a little logging town on the Oregon coast, maybe 2,800 people in it. And the floor would tremble because the trucks would come by and they'd have one log on them. And the log would be like from here, 10 feet in diameter, sometimes 12 feet in diameter. And that's all they could fit on the truck. And today, the same size truck will carry 35, 40 logs. To give you some idea of the difference between old growth and what we're cutting today. And I grew up in a logging town. I know logging pretty well. My relatives are loggers or fishermen, and I fished with my grandfather. So I can just read this.
But it was really, really dangerous.
Yeah, it was. My little high school class, 60 kids, 5 of my friends lost their fathers to accidents in the woods. It was at least once a year somebody died in the woods. It was just in this little town. It's the most dangerous profession in the world. I mean, I went and looked it up on Wikipedia. I'm sorry, but but it is, and fishing is just behind it.
Yeah.
Coal mining is more spectacular because when something goes wrong, then you lose 25 all at once. But the logging you have to understand there's cables, and the cables stretch, hundreds of yards, and they're under enormous tension. If one snaps, that cable's swinging all around, and if you're not quick, it'll take your head off, and logs roll, and trucks fall over, and so it's a dangerous profession. So I thought I would read a little bit here about Matty, who is the principal character is Aino, and her younger brother Matty. Aino's an organizer. She wants the one big union. She's a communist. Matty is just the opposite. He wants to get his own logging company and make money, and it's the American dream. And he's been given a job splitting wood, and that he's not a logger. They wouldn't call him a logger. He's just splitting wood, and for the steam donkey. The steam donkey. They used to haul the wood, the big logs out with donkeys. Well, then they substituted steam, big boilers and big cable roller things, and so they call them steam donkeys. They're also called yarders. So he's splitting wood to feed that thing. And one other thing you need to know is slash. When in the old growth logging, it's hard to imagine, but the trees would have no limbs up to about 80 or 100 feet because they were so densely packed that the limbs would die off, and that makes perfectly clear wood with no knots. So the construction industry in the early 20th century wouldn't accept wood with knots in it. So the loggers would cut the trees down 250 feet high, some, a few even up to 300, and they would leave all the trees that had the part with limbs on the ground. Well, you can imagine, they call it slash, and even today it's still enormous, and it builds up so that you can't get to the ground. It's just covered with all these felled trees that have been left there, just left behind. So this is, you'll have to understand this. A week after Ilmari, his older brother, revealed his plan to build a church to Aino, Matty made his first step on his own plan to have a logging company. A man had been crushed by a log. His crew had dragged the body up to the donkey and laid it next to the railroad tracks at the landing, followed by Toivo Huhtala. Matty watched Huhtala talk to the supervisor, the loggers called the side rod. The two men looked at him, and the side rod nodded his head. When Hutala reached Matty, he asked, "How old are you, really?" 16. Hutala looked at the cordwood. Matty was easily 2 days ahead of the donkey. "You think you're ready?" he asked Matty. Matty drove his splitting maul into the block and never looked back. He started at the bottom, setting chokers. Setting chokers is the toughest, dirtiest, most exhausting job in the woods. A choker setter's job was to dig, burrow, climb, and crawl under and over the huge logs to wrap a steel cable, called a choker, around the log and back onto itself using a C-hook. The thinner choker cable was attached to a much larger cable called the main line, which was reeled in by the steam donkey, sometimes hundreds of yards away. When the main line was jerked into action by the donkey engineer, the smaller cable choked down on the log, hence its name. The log was ripped from its place on the ground, twisting as it moved, to be hauled at great speed up to the landing next to the steam donkey. And when that log moved, the choker setter must have already been moving out of its way, or he'd be killed or maimed. Choker setters had to be young, strong, fast on their feet, and fearless. It was where all the loggers started, real loggers. Matty swelled with pride as he headed for the ravine through the jackstraw confusion of slash. The thrill of the new job lasted about 30 seconds. He would reach the top of a tangle of limbs, feeling them moving beneath him, only to fall through to the ground, the top of the tangle above his head. It took a huge effort to get back on top of the slash. He could hear Hutala cursing at him for his slowness, obviously enjoying himself. Breathing hard, he watched Hutala and the other experienced loggers moving across the slash as if they were dancers, timing their moves, using the spring back of the limbs to move gracefully onto the next tangle. They covered ground easily at 10 times his own speed. He arrived at the downed trees in the ravine, gasping for air, understanding fully what loggers meant by brush legs. Fallers were chopping or sawing trees, balancing 6 to 8 feet above the ground on metal-tipped boards hammered into the tree's side. This way, they were above the swell of the tree's butt, making it easier to fell. 2 fallers to a tree, they swung their double-bitted axes alternately in steady, efficient rhythms, each bite of the axe taking out large chips of wood. Other fallers who'd already made their undercut were balanced on the backside of their trees, pulling 12-foot-long crosscut saws between them. Back and forth, each one pulling in turn, cutting toward the undercut, pouring oil or kerosene on the saw to keep it from binding, occasionally driving wedges to keep the cut open, sawing without stop, sometimes for hours, before the tree started to tremble, then groan, as the remaining wood hinge between the undercut and the saw cut gave way with a sustained cracking sound. Just an aside, in the research, a woman analyzed the input and output of the mess halls in a logging camp. The loggers averaged 16,000 calories a day. That gives you some idea of hard work. We have no idea. It's Michael Phelps level. So they worked hard. The fallers would scramble for their lives as the huge trees moaned and whistled through the air, nearly silent once the splintering at the base ended to smash to the earth, sending vibrations through the ground for hundreds of feet. The fallers would gather their equipment, walk to the next tree, and do it again. Hutala pulled out his puko and began slashing the hem of Matty's trouser legs about halfway up the boot. This is called stagging your trousers. You're less likely to get snagged on something, and if you do, you'd much rather have your trousers ripped than lose a leg. He stood. Or worse, this game is not a game for children. He looked carefully at the buttons holding Matty's suspenders and grunted. Not too much thread, no belt. Same reason. Matty knew that same reason meant you could die. You pay attention, Hutala said, all the time. No daydreaming about your girlfriends. I tell you to do something, you do it instantly. Watch everyone, all the time. Work from the uphill side whenever you can. If you lose your balance, always fall toward the rigging. Don't walk, don't run, fly. The place to rest is in the grave.
So that's Deep River, which is just out and getting wonderful reviews all over. And So now I think we can open it up for questions. I think there's a microphone that we could probably hear each other, but I think they want it on the tape if they.
I just have to ask more about turning ghosts into ancestors. That's your comment upon reading your first novel, is that
Well, yeah,
right?
particularly this one,
Okay,
which is
can
the
you just
nonfiction.
say a little more about that? It's a fascinating.
Well, when you're in combat, the range of emotions and what hits you is so enormous and so intense. And most Marines certainly are like 18 and 19 years old. The average age in my platoon was 18 and 10 months. So, I mean, these are kids, all right? But they do such stuff that's so intense, it just is overwhelming. And it's horrible stuff, and as Morgan was saying, it's ecstatic stuff. I mean, one of the things that you do is you lose I mean, the mystics are always talking about losing your ego, losing your ego. Well, when you join in with a platoon of infantry, you're no longer that important, and everything you do is for the other, and that's losing your ego. And the other thing they talk about is being in the moment. If you're not in the moment, you're dead. So you're in the moment. And the other things that are so similar to the mystical experience happen in combat, but they happen to 19-year-olds who are not prepared in the least for it, including me. And so when you come back, you can't talk to anybody about it. Our culture just doesn't work that way. And particularly Vietnam veterans. I mean, we just kept quiet. We didn't want to upset anybody. And so how do you deal with that? What do you do? And if you don't deal with it, I mean, suicides, alcoholism, drug addictions, that's how kids deal with stuff. And so how do you sort of make sense out of it? How do you bring it to a place where you could find meaning in it? And one of the things that I had to face is that the war, in my opinion, was wrong. I mean, it was a mistake. It was a terrible mistake. And we knew it in 1965. I mean, I was involved in this Ken Burns documentary, which I recommend highly to everybody. And they have the guys on the phone, McNamara, Johnson, Kennedy, they were all saying, well, we can't win this, but we got an election coming up. We can't admit that, And in 65, we had 2,000 dead. By 69, we had 59,000 dead. So just coming back and realizing that, gosh, that was for nothing, What do you do with that? Well, I had to sort of focus on what it did for me, for my spiritual path, my soul development. It's the only way I could find meaning. I could never justify it politically. So that's what turning my ghosts into ancestors was. It was primarily here. The novel is based on the Parsifal myth, which is the myth of the young man coming to maturity. And that is what the focus of that is, whereas this is much more focused on, the soul and lying and ecstasy, all those issues that just basically blow your brains out when you're that young.
Yeah.
It's a little bit ironic that Finns would escape Imperial Russia and go to the part of the United States that used to be under control of Imperial Russia.
Right, yeah.
But was there a heavy logging industry in Finland that naturally inclined these young men to get into that?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you got to support Howie Hawkins for president. He's a force recon Marine from Vietnam. Upstate Howie Hawkins.
Oh, yeah.
Look him up.
I don't know what your comment on Howie was.
I'll tell you later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the Finns in the forest.
Yeah. No, I mean, in Finland, at the turn of the 20th century, the principal occupations were forestry. They had a boat building industry, which was wiped out by England, basically, and Germany, when they started building boats out of iron. And so that industry went into severe decline, and so a lot of these Finns that had been making their living logging had no work. So that was a thing. The other thing that they did was subsistence farming. And so they went to places in the world, northern Michigan, Minnesota, the Northwest, where there was logging and fishing. And because that was another thing all along that Baltic coast, little villages were supported by fishing. And so the thing was, and I can remember my great uncles who came from Finland, they said it was astounding. I mean, Finland's cold, and so the trees are this big around. And they came, to the Northwest, and they literally are from here over to that wall around. It was like, holy shit. I mean, they said it was just mind-boggling. And the government gave you, if you're married, 360 free acres. I mean, to a Finn that was struggling in Finland, it was just like the golden land. I mean, it was really, we forget how enticing America was and still is to people. I mean, people come here to do better, to get their kids to go to college, to make more money, to have meaningful work. Nothing's changed in that. And a lot of the things in this novel, I was amazed at how similar it is still today. Just different.
And prejudice against the immigrants.
Totally,
and,
yeah. Not only that, but the previous immigrants prejudiced against the new coming immigrants.
And then the new ones prejudiced the next ones.
Exactly. No, I mean, it's the American way, and sometimes we might actually get around it. The other thing that was really interesting to me, I'm sort of riffing here, but is there was something called the Espionage Act of 1917, and it was used to crush the IWW. And it was sold to the American public because it was a way that we could protect ourselves from Bolshevism, and the Bolsheviks, of course, were in the union movement and everything. And so Americans gave up an enormous amount of freedom. The Espionage Act, one of the clauses was, if you were caught thinking about overthrowing the government, you could be thrown in jail. And in one night, the Justice Department arrested 270 IWW leaders on the grounds of thinking about overthrowing the government. They just crushed the union. Hello, Patriot Act. We have given up enormous amounts of privacy, enormous amounts of freedom, and because, oh my God, the Taliban's going to come across the beaches at Santa Monica, and the terrorists are coming after us. And and stuff's being sold today because the Mexicans are coming across the border. And I mean, Americans haven't changed much, and I'm not real proud of us.
I'd like to go back to what you said about finding your soul and trying to work out what happened to you during the war era. You also mentioned that music can also be a very big part of the recovery process and all that, music therapy. But the Vietnam era was also like the golden age of rock and roll music. You had The Who, you had Janis Joplin, and Beatles and Queen.
Oh, yeah.
And so, did music play a big part in your life? And was there a particular artist or band that you were?
Oh yeah. No. I mean, first of all, it was really interesting is that there were types of music, and it was divided along ethnic, racial grounds. There were people like me that we were the Rolling Stones, right? And then there were the African Americans, James Brown. I'm black and I'm proud, and so soul music, and I talk a lot about that in Matterhorn. And then there was country western, which the African Americans called washtubs and broomsticks, and the guys from Western North Carolina called jungle music, and it was banter. I mean, there was no anger, animosity, but it was absolutely divided who had what kinds of music, and there are certain songs though that crossed over, like We Got to Get Out of This Place. I think that was the Animals.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an anthem for Vietnam veterans. I mean, kids would sing that just to get drunk and sing We Got to Get Out of This Place just at the tops of their voices. It was just part of that. Hey Jude was an important one. Don't take a sad song and make it better. And I heard it on the grapevine. We got a lot of Dear John letters. And I heard it on the grapevine, "You No Longer Be Mine," and kids would sing that. It would. That kind of music was very much a comfort and a part of the culture, and it did speak to the veterans. And so I think that you scratch a Vietnam veteran, you'll find a song that was really meaningful from that time period. And I have to say, it was an enormously important and productive time period in American pop music. It was amazing what the artists that appeared then, country western, rock and roll, even jazz artists. It was an incredibly productive era.
I have more of a craft question for you. It sounds like you had to slice away a lot of your work over your 3 different books. And when you're rereading to, say, take out a character, how do you keep your own words sort of new in your mind and not just become something that you've cast your eyes over so many times after creating them that they kind of get emptied of their power?
Oh, interesting. First of all the characters come out of me. They're part of me, and when I get them out and write them down on a piece of paper, they don't lose any power at all. I mean, it's because the characters are here. They're not on the page, you know. I mean, it's a kind of a magic thing, isn't it? You can just have black and white ink and some paper, and then someone else can look at that black and white ink and paper, and suddenly my character gets transferred over to your character. And literature itself is about identifying with characters. I mean, commercial fiction, I mean, James Bond doesn't change, right? And some people might identify with James Bond, but I kind of never did. It's like, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that, you know? It's sort of like trying to identify with Michael Jordan. I mean, I like to play basketball, but, you know. But good characters in literature, you see the world through their eyes, and you change. And for the writer, it's the same thing. I mean, his characters or her characters come out of their soul, out of their heart. And putting them on paper, you don't lose any of that. And so, you know, it's like, do you get tired of your kids? I mean, sometimes they annoy you, but you know, you don't get tired of them because they're part of your family, and it's the same feeling to me.
Thanks. I was curious a little bit about the kind of process of letting the story unfold in front of you, and specifically, you know, you hear some authors talk about the need to thinking about the 58-page outline, of really thinking things through and writing a comprehensive outline that really is a roadmap. And other authors talk about, you know, are completely opposed to that and talk about kind of sitting down and almost discovering the story themselves, letting it kind of happen with the understanding that sometimes you go far down a road that just isn't working and you need to come back, but still letting that unfold. Do you have any thoughts on kind of how
I mean,
you've
obviously,
done that?
different strokes for different folks. I mean, I outline, and I think another thing is if it's a big, complex novel, the odds of getting yourself painted into a corner are really high. I mean, and then you add a historical novel. I mean, you can have, you know, some great storyline, and then you realize that, oh, the Depression didn't happen until 2 years later. You know. And then, you know, you know, I mean, I have an Excel spreadsheet where I have actual historical events and my story events, and I realize that this part of the novel can't happen yet. It's got to happen after this happens over here, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Tolstoy outlined or not, but if you're a genius, I suppose you can handle it. But I'm not a genius, and so I have to outline. The other thing is if you're writing something contemporary, where there aren't historical issues, or it's shorter, you know. I mean, all that maybe you don't need to outline, and there is something to be said for the spontaneity. But quite frankly, the outline doesn't cut the spontaneity. I mean, I often would vary from the outline. I'd be going along, and I'd go like, whoa, I like the way this is going, you know, and the outline just falls to the side. But it really was important to me to keep me on track, because I mean, you could write 2 or 3 chapters and then realize, oh God, that won't work, you know. So I'm in favor of outlining. What about you, Morgan? Well, you're the editor, you know.
Different strokes for different folks.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what you're setting out to do. I remember that 50-odd page outline. I said, this is going to be a 5,000-page book. Because not only did you have a gigantic number of characters, you also were trying to cover about 50 years of history. And it was like, and then I think one of the keys of what I found working with authors over the years, one of the hardest things to do is to handle time. is to be able to know when to summarize, right? And what I would always say is that you can cover that entire 5-year period in a sentence if you want to, right? Whereas a writer often feels that they've got to
plot all the way along, January, February, March, yeah.
But I've also, I don't know, I think it is different for different writers. I strongly encourage outlining because I think it helps the writer articulate, whether they're going to show it to me or their editor, whoever, I think it helps them shape the idea in their head. And I would say more than half the writers that I've worked with over the years have done some form of an outline. But then there are brilliant writers who don't. So
I think we have enough time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. Kind of on the same lines of ideas and what stories come from where. Having read a lot of Vietnam War era fiction, yours and Tim O'Brien, countless others, also Viet Thanh Nguyen, and also having grown up in the Pacific Northwest, I noticed so much that there are parallels between the atmospheric nature of Vietnam as a country as compared to the Pacific Northwest, like going into the woods near Cannon Beach, all these places where it's like there's a mist over everything. There's kind of this surreality to where you are. And I'm curious, the question is still sort of forming itself as I'm talking, but I'm curious.
You did an outline.
I know, as I've now learned, need to get on that boat. I guess what I'm curious is how much, as you were writing Deep River, which is about this very particular part of the world, how, did you ever, and also you're writing about violence, you're writing about things that happen to bodies and to, I assume, probably minds and families and all kinds of stuff. How much, if at all, did you find yourself sort of thinking back to Matterhorn in the process of writing that, and sort of not necessarily drawing directly off of that writing and that story, but just sort of, if you kind of notice moments where you're describing, these woods, this forest in the Pacific Northwest, and kind of that reminds me almost of, this part in Matterhorn, or, places in Vietnam. And stuff like that.
Well, no, I mean, there's a lot of similarities. First of all, they're both rainforests. I mean, the Northwest is called, in the geography, serious geography, it's called temperate rainforest, 120 inches a year on the coast. Makes huge trees. Vietnam, massive amounts of rain, and hills, I mean, really steep hills. I mean, and, I was shocked. We were cold, and we had guys that, almost died from hypothermia, including me, because we were up so high, 5,000 foot above sea level in Vietnam. In total, forest. And I kind of actually, when I was there, thought often about how similar it was. I mean, you could just look at the landscape and the wildlife, and it's so there are similarities. There's no doubt about it. And writing this, Deep River, I every once in a while an image would come by. The other thing is that the symbolism is important. The jungle in Matterhorn is the unconscious. It's where they struggle always to pull themselves up from the jungle, and the forest is a huge symbol in Deep River, as is the Columbia River itself, and the cycle of the rain itself is a big symbol. The renewal of life, and it goes down to the ocean, comes back up. It's the Selkirks, it's the Tetons, and comes all the way back down again with the salmon. And so the jungle in Matterhorn and the forest in Deep River, it evokes the same symbols to me, and therefore the same feelings. I mean, my view of symbols is that we can't even imagine, God. I mean, it's just like, we have a word for it. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. And what we have are these symbols. They're like transformers. I mean, if you put your finger into a 220 volt socket, it'll kill you, right? But if you have a transformer, and then you can actually use it, you can iron clothes with it and do whatever you want with it. And symbols are transformers of that power that's beyond us. And so at least in my writing, the novels that I write, I'm very aware. And obviously those symbols were in both novels.
We have time for one last question, and then there will be a signing in the cafe in the next room.
I just wondered about your journey as a writer. It sounds like 30 years to get Matterhorn published. Did you set out to become a writer? Are you surprised that you became such an accomplished writer?
Finally, yeah.
I mean, who taught you to write? I mean, it's just a very interesting idea of how your journey came about.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to being a musician. I mean, I have friends who have kids who are talented, right? Little Susie doesn't want to take piano lessons anymore. And so, I used to play the piano, and so they come to me and say, well, gosh, Susie's really good at the piano. Should we just make her take piano lessons? And I'll say, well, can Susie walk by the piano without touching it? Well, you sure? Well, don't give her lessons. Because a musician, I mean, Jimi Hendrix, when he got his guitar, he was like 11, he slept with it, okay? And with me, I mean, ever since I was a kid, I started writing my dreams down when I was 8. I mean, I just had to write them down. I mean, I don't know why. And I had a little diary, and I wrote my diary, and it was very important to my development. I love to tell this story because after I'd been writing in my diary a couple of years, I was probably 9 or 10, I thought, well, I'll go back and just see what I wrote, And so I remember, I burned it in my brain. I picked up my diary because my folks had given it to me for Christmas, and it started on January 1st. And it was literally, went down to the pond. There was a pond where and I said there was no ducks, but there was a water snake. All right, it's not a great novel, but it's shorter. Good, Morgan would like it. And it hit me like just overwhelmed me. I'll never do that again. Never do that again. That's done. That's gone. And that was brought home to me, mortality, at an early age because of writing. And so here I am, feeling the power of this stuff. And the fear, I took that diary, and to my great regret, I went out and burned it because I didn't know what to do with that overwhelming fear of death. And again, I grew up in a logging town where there was death all the time. So I think death was probably more prevalent for me than a lot of other young people. So when you say, what about writing? It just I couldn't help myself. It was just the way I've been built, kind of speak. I've never studied it formally. When I wrote the first draft of Matterhorn, I wrote it in first person. It was 1,700 A4 pages long, and I thought, well, this is easy writing novels. And I came back and started reading it, and it was really crap. It was awful. So I started all over again. I just threw all that out. And the way I sort of taught myself is I literally, first of all, I said, who are the great page-turner writers? I took Louis L'Amour, who writes Westerns, and I took Danielle Steele. And I took several of their books, and I outlined them. I just went, and I outlined, here's what happens when this character goes, and this one, and it was like, after a while, I was like, well, wait a second. If the chapter ends and the character's up a tree, then they want to find out if he gets out or not, It was kind of learning by actually, and I picked up on that because I read someplace that the early Renaissance painters learned how to paint by being in shops with the masters that taught them how to do it, I thought, well, actually, I can do that. I don't need to, and then I got books, how to develop characters, how to, there's thousands of them. There are probably thousands of them right here in this building. And so that's the way that was my, quote, training. Yeah.
So I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good, thank you very much.
Is Karl going to be available to sign books?